Greetings everyone. I welcome you all again to this very special edition of Geo Interview with Professor Kerry Brown, who is one of the most sought after voices in the field of Chinese studies. Sir, I hope you are doing great and it's an honor to have you in person.
Thank you very much.
Right. So to give our viewers a brief background about our guest, he currently serves as the director at the Law China Institute at King's College London. Professor Brown's extensive expertise covers Chinese history post 1949, Chinese political economy, elite politics, and international relations, particularly UK-China and UK-EU-China relations as well. So, Professor Brown has authored more than 20 books on modern Chinese politics and is a sought-after commentator on the contemporary China across major international news outlets. So, Professor Brown, thank you for doing this, and let's get started with the conversation. So, how do you perceive the current trajectory of China's domestic politics, and what are the key factors driving these policies? Can you dissect the Chinese politics for our viewers?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think that Chinese politics is extremely involved with the country's economic challenges at the moment, which are increasingly serious. And there's just been a big meeting in Beijing in July 2024. One of these plenums, the third plenum, which tried to kind of set out a blueprint for how to deal with these economic issues. At the moment, Xi Jinping is dominant and seems to, kind of be everywhere and doing everything. But I mean, I think at some point there will have to be some sign of who will replace him eventually. He can't go on forever. And I think that will be increasingly urgent as we go towards the next big Congress for the party in 2027. I imagine that's what most speculation will focus on. What happens after Xi?
Right. So, is there a replacement for Xi Jinping in China? Like, what's going on in the elite circles of China?
Well, no, I mean, there isn't any obvious replacement. All the people who currently serve beside Xi Jinping on what we call the Standing Committee of the Politburo, that's the sort of top level 7-man, it's all men at the moment, 7-man strong body. I mean, all of those are around about the same age as Xi, apart from one person, Ding Xuexiang, who's a little bit younger. I think he's about a decade younger. So, I mean, he's potentially someone, but it doesn't seem that he's got quite the kind of attributes that would be necessary. So there's no one immediately apparent. And, there's no one that you could say today, okay, this person is in the number 2 slot there, definitely going to be the replacement. It's all extremely unclear.
Right. So, if we go talk about the foreign policy of China, People's Republic of China, can you share some insights on the evolving dynamics between China and the other global powers, and particularly the United States? Like how these relationships are shaping the global order?
Indeed. I mean, Chinese foreign policy is intimately linked with two things. Three things. One is its domestic situation and how its foreign relations help it deal with its domestic challenges, whether they're environmental, economic, or even social. The second is its relationship with its region. So it's surrounded by 14 border countries, and then it's got a big sea region around it. So it's got a complicated neighborhood. Countries like India, Pakistan, Russia, North Korea, Myanmar. I mean, this is not an easy neighborhood. And then finally, its relationships with the United States. And all of these are not easy at the moment. With the United States, I think China is watching the 2024 presidential election closely and is probably really kind of trying to work out, well, what is the impact of a new Trump presidency going to be if that happens? Or what is the impact of, a Democrat under possibly Kamala Harris, but maybe someone else who is going to also probably be as equally assertive on China and trying to get better trade deals. So it's a tough geopolitical role that China's playing. Whether it's playing that role well or not, I mean, that's subject to debate. There's some ways in which China is just trying to find a balancing act, like with Russia, Ukraine. And there's other ways where it's probably more deeply involved now. Some of the areas around it, the Belt and Road Initiative, things like this. And then there's other issues in which I think it just wants to keep away from them. I mean, the Middle East is one where it's very hesitant to get too involved. So its balancing act is an easy one to sort of put off balance. At the moment, it's just about keeping that balance, but it's getting probably more difficult by the day.
Right. So do you think Russia and China can get along? Like I read one of your article where you said that where you debated that can Russia be a junior partner of China? So how Russia and China are looking at each other right now?
I mean, India and China or ASEAN and China?
About Russia and China. So how Russia
Uh,
and China looking at each other?
or the big region, Asia and China,
Yes,
Asia and China. Yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah. I mean, I think that China's vision is to have a kind of you know, be the dominant player in Asia. I mean, that's its I think that's its immediate aim, and to some extent, it's achieved that up to a point. I mean, there's one problem, and that is the continuing role of the United States in providing security through the Navy in the Asian region. I mean, you know, the Pacific Fleet, I think it's the Seventh Fleet, Seventh USA Navy Fleet. Obviously, this frustrates China, but it supplies a certain amount of stability and security in its region. So I think it's a mixed issue. But also its relations with key other Asian powers, from Japan to India to Indonesia. I mean, they're all very varied, but there's no sort of easy kind of simple narrative for these relations. I mean, all of them are overshadowed to some extent by history. You know, Japan in the Second World War, and India in the border dispute from '62. Even Indonesia in the way in which so many people of Chinese heritage were killed in the '60s when the revolution happened. I mean, there's many issues that China has with its region from history, but I think what it's trying to do is use its economic, you know, kind of potential to create a common interest and at least pragmatic engagement across that region.
Okay. So based on your extensive research and publications, what are the most challenges and opportunities in engaging with China from a diplomatic and strategic standpoint? Like it's very hard to deal with the Chinese since what they say and what they do differs a lot.
Indeed, I mean, China is keen to have its status recognized. It wants to be a major power, a great power. And so a lot of countries, I think, feel that they have to almost constantly flatter China and make China feel good. China is easy to offend, as we all know. We can all be accused of hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. So diplomatically, it's a kind of emotional thing. How do you deal with China? It's not so much what you're negotiating. I mean, China is often very pragmatic in some ways. It's driven by self-interest, and you know, if you have a lot of awareness of your own self-interest, and you're probably going to be able to negotiate with China okay. But it's really more about the feelings, the way that China can get quite upset quite quickly, and get sort of quite emotional and almost sort of you know, kind of blackmail people with this emotional, you know, sort of this sense of being a victim. So it's difficult to deal with China in a wholly kind of rational, functional way. You kind of tend to get wrapped up in emotions quite quickly with China. I think the most successful are probably countries like Japan that are very sort of aware of, they're very skeptical of Chinese power, but they know what they want from China, and they kind of know how to at least do things without getting into big arguments with China, even though they're accused by China a lot of the time of, you know, kind of not respecting their history. And I think, you know, other countries like, you know, in the region, that, you know, Singapore seems to kind of be able to manage a balance between the US and China. It's not easy, but it manages to sort of do that. It's a very hard thing to have a successful China policy. Not many countries have it.
Right. So what is the China dream that Xi Jinping talks a lot about?
Well, I think that the Xi Jinping's vision, I don't know if it's doctrine, but it's a vision, is to make China great again. It's quite simple. And it's about a renaissance, rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. The idea that China should be number one in the region and maybe globally, but not in the same way as America. I mean, different, very unique and bespoke. I think China is not a hegemon in the sense that it wants dominance, security, responsibility. It doesn't want to spend money looking after the interests of others, which is what it thinks America has done. And it certainly wouldn't want the kind of relationship that, you know, America has in the Middle East, particularly with Israel and other countries there, where it's, you know, almost duty bound to help and get involved, even when it's not entirely clear whether it's in America's interests. For China, it's very hard-nosed and tries to just have this idea of win-win, and its vision is a world just led on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which obviously came in the 1950s from, actually borrowed from, I think taken originally from India, the foreign policy of India, you know, non-aligned interference in others. I think its vision is a world run on that system. And that's partially come into existence, but there's still the Western-led world, the political West-led world, which is run on a different set of values. And that's why we're in this difficult position now, because both of those systems are running at the same time.
Right. So, drawing your role as a director at the Law China Institute, what initiatives or programs have been the most effective in promoting, let's say, understanding and engagement with China? Since we talked about that, it's very hard to talk with Chinese people, with China on a diplomatic terms, but still, what's your take on it?
Well, I mean, I think we have a responsibility in Britain and in the West more generally, and globally, to be honest, in India or Australia or wherever, we all have a responsibility to be educated about China. It's no good having an attitude towards China. I mean, all of us can have that, know nothing. But what we need to know is, what are we dealing with, and what is it about China that we need to know. And I think actually, you know, knowledge of Chinese politics is not easy. It's not a very open system, but we need to understand why the Communist Party is still so dominant and why there isn't any opposition. We need to understand the complexity of China. There's not an easy answer to its developmental challenges. I think we need to understand that China, in some respects, has been successful. We need to be educated about that. You know, it's eradicated, like India, it's lifted a lot of people out of poverty. I mean, the world is significantly better place now, despite all the pessimism in the West, because hundreds of millions of people principally in Asia, are now living better lives than they did even 10 or 20 years ago. And many of those are in China and India. So I think we shouldn't dismiss this achievement. I mean, it's a massive achievement. And I think the West sometimes needs to just be more aware of how far China has come, and the fact that, well, we have big issues now, but we're not dealing with a country that is, you know, failing economically. I mean, it's challenged, but it's not failing. It's looking after its own affairs. It's, you know, that is better than dealing with a country that is failing and creating massive diplomatic and geopolitical issues for that reason, rather than its relative success.
So, do you think there's some miscommunication between the great powers when it comes to deciding the geopolitics of the Asia? Like Chinese see Asia in a different tone, while the people in West see it in a different tone altogether. Since there are more interdependence of both of them in the markets concentrated in Asia. So, what can be done with it? How can we engage them in a constructive dialogue that is good for everyone, a positive sum game, if you will?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the global involvement in Asia is through very many different fora. There's ASEAN, which America is an observer of. That's just meeting at the moment, I believe, in about Myanmar, in Laos. And China is an observer too. There's APAC, the Asia Pacific, APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Community. There's the Quad, which India is part of. There's AUKUS, you know, the Australia, UK, US sort of treaty alliance. You know, there's all sorts of different kind of a mishmash of these different acronyms. So it's difficult to get some kind of consistency and unity. I mean, it's not to have an Asia Europe meeting. There is an Asia Europe meeting, to have a, you know, kind of an Asians, Europeans, and Americans kind of coming together. I mean, it's almost like the United Nations. I mean, that's a big grouping. However, you know, the most dynamic economies in the world now are in those areas. We have to recognize that. I mean, Europe is still an important economic bloc. America is still growing strongly. Asia still has very dynamic economies. So some way of those three in particular talking more fruitfully and with more balance is good. At the moment, though, America is in such a divided state and is so committed to the idea of a China threat that it won't allow Europeans in particular to be too close to China in particular. it gets very, very protective. And so it's a very difficult situation now to try and get three already very distinctive partners like Asia, Europe, and America to sort of talk in a common framework. It's more difficult than ever before, but it's a very necessary, kind of discussion, because those three really are key to solving the world's environmental problems, the world's economic challenges, and geopolitical issues too.
Of course. So how do you see the situation with Taiwan? Like China is claiming that it is an undivided part of the mainland. Yet I know a few people in Taiwan personally who are the next generation after the Kuomintang, after the World War post World War era. So they see Taiwan in a very different lens. They see as a let's just say a realm of free society and everything that comes with it. But when they go to the older generation, their parents, they kind of have a different take on the situation. So how is that working out?
Well, I mean, Taiwan matters massively to China for symbolic reasons and emotional reasons, and that shouldn't be dismissed. I mean, it's the one issue that China consistently says is a priority, so we have to take it seriously. The problem is that Taiwan itself is now extremely Taiwanese. I mean, surveys show people see themselves overwhelmingly as Taiwanese, not Taiwanese Chinese, and definitely not Chinese. So it's very distinctive. And as time has gone on, it's more and more difficult to see how you can have even the most loose reunification. I mean, so I think it's probably the issue we need to kind of be most careful about, but leave as it is. The status quo has to be maintained. There is no solution at the moment. Taiwan is too different. China is not a democracy. You can't really put two such different powers together. And also, even if it were to be done by force, that would have devastating impact on the world's economy. And, it would be diplomatically really the time when China suddenly becomes very isolated, and the costs would be colossal. So I think it's best to just leave this issue. The One China policy has been an effective policy for nearly 50 years. I think that's probably the best we've got. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. And the idea of trying to use Taiwan as a way of pushing back against China, which some American politicians have done recently, is very dangerous. It could blow up in their faces. So I think status quo is the best we can achieve.
Oh, so I wasn't aware of it that there is a bipartisan support for Taiwan, but it goes this deep. I wasn't aware of that. So coming back to India-China relations now, how do you view the current state of India-China relations, and what are the key reasons behind the tension that is going on? And is there a cooperation possible between the two countries?
Well, I think China-India relations are hugely important. And, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi of China, I mean, they've got a relatively good personal relationship, apparently. And I mean, I think that in the last 10 years, it's been a stable relationship. It's gone through some challenges. The border region, disputed border region, now has this sort of zone of, kind of neutrality. So that's stopping some of the tensions. I mean, in terms of economy, I think they're going to be more and more important. India's growth rate has been good in the last few years. I think they are really going to be shaping the next century. And so they have to have some kind of way of working with each other. But historically, they aren't natural allies. I mean, border countries often aren't. And I don't think that it's going to be easy for them. And finally, I mean, they're both extremely strong sort of cultural powers. I mean, they have a strong sense of their distinctiveness and very, very kind of powerful sense of, who they are. And I think that that's probably going to be the biggest problem. Their cultural differences are quite profound, and they probably don't understand each other as much as they should. Certainly, I don't think China understands India. It's quite dismissive of it. There's not much study of India in China that I've come across in the last 40, 35 years. There's more study centers for Australia and New Zealand in China than there are for India. That seems very strange. So we have to, I mean, be very apprehensive about this relationship and hope that China and India are able to kind of create some balance. But they are not, they're not straightforward partners.
Of course. So, do you think there is a way that India and China can work out? And let's make the issue, the regional and global challenges such as climate change, as the center of the engagement that goes on between the both nations rather than the historical disputes of water areas. So, is there a possibility with that? Do that? How does that work out?
Well, I mean, I think India and China need China needs a new framework probably with a lot of its partners because it seems to get stuck in a lot of these historic issues. Let's include Japan. I mean, it's sometimes often kind of a backward-looking power in some ways, but obviously always going forward in terms of its own development. I mean, I think with India, there obviously needs to be a new framework. I think they just have to. I think the first thing they have to do is to take each other seriously. They have common interests on environmental issues, nuclear proliferation. They're both nuclear powers. There's a lot of things that they have common reason to work together on. And I think that's going to really lead their cooperation in the coming decade. I think that they will be okay. I think that India and China will be able to work things out, um, but it won't be easy. It definitely won't be easy.
So, coming back to Indo-Pacific, how does China see Indo-Pacific, and how does United States see at it? And what are the contradictions that are going on between both of them in this region?
Well, I don't think China does see the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't really believe it. It thinks of it as being just an American construction. And I think it's hard. The Indo-Pacific is really just a sort of trying to create this counterbalance against China, but I don't think that's very easy. At the end of the day, China is the only show in the town. I mean, it's so dominant in that East Asian region, and I think the Indo-Pacific is really trying to kind of create some sort of balance, but I don't think that it's coherent. I mean, you've put a lot of investment into this, but you're talking about very disparate, different partners. I mean, India and the countries around it are also not natural allies, of course, because of their histories and because of their difference in size and economy. And just because someone in the West draws a map and says this is the Indo-Pacific doesn't mean it exists.
Right. So, how does Europe sees China? Like, how it intends to engage with China in the issues that are multifaceted, and what is going on there?
So Europe is trying a balancing act at the moment. I mean, trying to keep between the United States and China. It has its own interests, and it's usually managed to get a little bit of autonomy. But I think it's proved very hard in the last few years. So it sort of uses the same framework of China being a competitor, a collaborator, and an adversary in some areas, and tries to sort of align that with the US. But the US changes a lot. I mean, it kind of goes from administration to administration. We're likely to go through a big change in November. Whoever's elected, there's going to probably be changes because it won't be the current president. He's retiring. So it's going to be kind of, Europe's going to have to continue really sort of trying to veer with the winds. It also has its own internal dynamics. Not all the countries are aligned on China. Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and Western Europe are different. But on the whole, all of them are facing quite strong economic problems at the moment, and China is probably a partner in that. And all of them pragmatically accept that China is a partner in climate change and things like this. So it's a kind of more often than people expect a collaborative relationship, but with security as a sort of big point of contention.
I see EU has to, European Union as a unit has to balance a lot between how the US works and how the China sees the world. So, right now, like if I take the example of what is going on in the EV sector, some countries within EU are against the sanctioning that is going on against Chinese EV supplies that are exported all around the world. But when it comes to something more related to the supply chain of it, there are some contradictions in that. Like, ha- so what I meant to say is that how EU and United States they can work together with.
Yeah. Well, on EV, on electric vehicles, yeah. Um, I mean, the European Union is strong as a kind of regulatory market area. And so this is the kind of issue where it feels it can push back, and the subsidizes overproduction, these things. I mean, the strange thing about this whole debate is, in fact, all of this is helping Europe deal with its environmental challenges. So it's very mixed. And the debate at the moment is still very, very political. It's the Chinese accusing Europe of not taking its products, and Europe saying, well, you're not doing things according to your agreements. This is the area where, it should just be EU-China. I mean, the US shouldn't really be part of this. In any way, the US obviously has had big EV production in China through Tesla, I mean, at least in the past. So I think it's kind of this sort of issue where the European Union sometimes takes the lead on the current status of the EV debate. I don't think it's resolved. I mean, it's mostly German manufacturers who are angry, car manufacturers, and they are a big lobby. They're a powerful lobby in Europe. But I mean, there hasn't been any major move recently, largely because of political issues in Europe, a lot of elections, a lot of change, a lot of unexpected events. The last big debate about subsidies with solar panels, was resolved after a while. So Europe and China can resolve their issues. And America wasn't massively involved in that. So in this area, really, I think Europe has some autonomy.
Right. So, I mean, you are so much experienced in the trade diplomacy, since you are you are the director at one of the institutes that is at the forefront of it. So, what sort of career advice will you give to people who want to make it into academics, just like yourself?
Well, to do different things. I mean, I was a diplomat, I was a business person, then I was a think tanker, and then I became an academic. You need to see China from different aspects to really have some ability to deal with the whole thing that it presents. I think if you just follow one of those tracks, it sort of restricts you in some ways. You don't really see the full picture. But I mean, for me, it's been a great honor to go to nearly 50 countries to lecture on China, including India, and to go to China over 100 times, to live there for 7 years. I feel it's a great honor that I've had so much experience of dealing with China and in so many different ways, and dealing with international affairs. And that's something I hope to continue doing.
So, Professor Brown, thank you very much for doing this, and I hope we can host you again for such another interview on the same topic or a different topic that we can agree upon. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good to see you. You take care.